Well, hey, friends, I'm John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center. Welcome to another Breakpoint forum where we're talking about following the science when it comes to transgender ideology. I'm very excited about our conversation, and I want to get into it just as quickly as possible. Now, for those keeping score at home, this is actually the second webinar and forum that we've done really on this topic this year. We did one back in January with some other medical experts, and really what happened is throughout the course of the year, I've had a number of conversations, followed a number of research reviews and other reports and articles that really have just kind of put some shape around something that we noticed at the beginning of this year, which is that this year just felt a whole lot different than last year, where last year it felt like the transgender ideology train was just running across not only our nation, but really the Western world. And yet what's happened is there's a lot of countries around the world really putting on the heavy brakes. There's a lot of data that's coming out that we should have known, but now we do know. And it's just at a completely different place. And earlier this year, I had the privilege of hosting a forum, a live forum with a small intimate group with our two guests today, and just so honored that both of these men were willing to join us again, and for something that's more live and that could be available to more people. And the content that you're going to get is incredibly important. Now, if you've joined us in the past for Breakpoint forums, you know that typically we give both of our presenters an opportunity to speak. This one's going to be a little bit different. It's going to be far more interview based, but we're still going to give you an opportunity to ask all the questions that you want. And some of you are already taking advantage of that. We haven't even started and we've already got several questions coming in. And that really underscores both the importance of the topic and the fact that this is not just some sort of issue happening in some other part of the world. For many of us, this is an issue as close as our own families, our own churches, our own homes, our own friends, and so on. If you want to text in your questions, you can go ahead and do that. The number here is on the screen, 844-872-1088. So the format is we're going to take the first part of tonight's forum. I'm going to ask a series of questions to our guests. They're going to communicate the things that they have been tracking and learning about this issue over the last several years. And then you're going to have a chance to interact with them by asking questions that I will vet and moderate as we go through. So very thankful for all of you being with us. Let me, without any further ado, welcome our guest. First, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Farr Curlin. Farr is the professor of medicine and the professor of medical humanities at Duke Divinity School. He's an associate of the Duke Initiative for Science and Society. He's co-director of the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative at Duke University and co-author of a book entitled The Way of Medicine, Ethics, and the Healing Profession, which was published in 2021. Dr. Curlin, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
And let me also welcome someone that you may have heard as well on the Upstream podcast with our colleague Shane Morris, and that's Dr. James Cantor. Dr. Cantor has been working on this issue for a long time in his role as a clinical psychologist. He specializes in psychology, the neuroscience of sex, as well as atypical sexualities. And he's been tracking this, as I said, for quite a while. Dr. Cantor's bio goes on in the various places that he's worked, professor at University of Toronto, editor of various scientific journals medical journals having to do with psychology and sex. Dr. Cantor, we're grateful to have you back in the Breakpoint orbit here this evening. Thanks so much for joining us.
A pleasure.
I want to also here as we begin and before we jump in, just say something that's really important. There is a theological case to be made on the issue of sex and gender and identity as God created it. There is a psychological aspect to this. There's a medical aspect of this and so on. And we hear over and over and over, often by items of a progressive agenda, follow the science, and follow the science. And that's really what we're doing tonight. It's important to note that Dr. Curlin and Dr. Cantor, we've worked together in other settings with other organizations as well. It would be it would be inaccurate to say we all share the same worldview, wouldn't it? We disagree on issues that are pretty dramatic, both in terms of sexual ethics, but also in terms of just, religion and spirituality. And yet on this, I really believe tonight, between Dr. Curlin and Dr. Cantor, we've got two of the most important voices on this issue. Specifically. So it really is a real treat. Dr. Cantor, I want to begin with you because, as I said in your introduction, you've been tracking this issue really for a long time. I have been tracking your tracking of it for at least, 2 years. And, I mentioned at the beginning here that just at the beginning of 2024, it seemed different than the beginning of 2023, that there were just these, stories and articles and reports that were popping up. We can think about what we have seen across the pond, primarily in Britain and other places. And of course, the Cass review created a very, very big splash at the beginning of this year, and rightly so. So I'm just going to hand it to you and let you talk us through. There have been notable developments in the last several years on this issue. What are they?
All of that is absolutely true. And it's very strange from my point of view. I've been, involved in what makes people sexually interested in whatever they're interested in more than 25 years now. So, one atypical sexuality versus another. I've seen a lot of these topics evolving over time. And this one hasn't been like the others. This one, there's much less discussion of the science and much more discussion about how does it make you feel? Well, those are important topics, but that's not how to get the concrete, actual facts about which you have your feelings. This one, things changed, again, from my point of view, starting maybe about 10 years ago. Something in the culture changed. There was something very, very different going on. I've been seeing, both as a psychologist and as a scientist, genuine transsexuals, people who really were better off and happier living as the other sex for a long time. Starting 10 years ago, the people coming into clinics were different. They were not motivated by the same things, and they were not as healthy, and they were not benefiting by transition like before that. As I say, something changed. But in just the past 2 years, now others are beginning to actually say, the science that we had doesn't apply to this new group. Something, as I said, the research that we used to be going by doesn't seem to apply to this new generation. So even though those of us who have been around it for a long time kind of saw this train coming, it's really just been in the past 2 years or so that the large establishments, healthcare systems of entire countries, England, Finland, Sweden, they've been now doing proper reviews of the science and realizing, that funny guy from Canada's kind of been onto something all along. This group isn't like the previous groups. Governments outside the US are now, rather than continuing on whoever wants to transition, go ahead, are now starting to restrict it, ban it, and put heavy, heavy brakes on what's going on now that it's become much clearer that the evidence is showing that these people are not benefiting by it.
When you say that folks are not benefiting by it, you're talking about specifically the drugs and the therapy and the procedures that are allowing them to kind of live in this idea that they were born into the wrong body. Is that what you're referring to?
Both of the major parts. What you were talking about perfectly correctly are, I usually call it medicalized transition. The parts of transition that actually require somebody with a medical license administering the medications. Puberty blockers, of course, is one of the largest components, cross-sex hormones, and various surgeries, mastectomies or genital surgeries. But also we're finding that social transition is not associated with psychological benefits. It's been a very, very common story amongst a lot of activists that the reason that these kids are expressing distress is because of transphobia, because they're not being acknowledged in the sex they want to be. But, with a legitimate, formal, without a foregone conclusion, when neutral research is being done, they're still distressed. They're still unhappy. The transition isn't what's bothering these kids. The lack of affirmation isn't what's been bothering these kids. There's something else going on. And the transition, all of a sudden, that just makes kids, when they don't feel better, instead believe that, oh, I must have to take the next step. Maybe it will be the next step of transition will make me feel better. So even when they realize that the first initial steps of transition aren't helping, they actually are asking for more of it instead of realizing that the whole idea was a mistake, and they need to be going about, mostly what these kids need are psychotherapy to deal with the distress itself. But we're just setting them up on a conveyor belt towards more and more medical transition with no decent evidence that is going to help.
Is there evidence? So it's one thing that there's no evidence that it's going to help. Is there evidence that it's actually, that some of these treatments, both the social transitioning, but especially the puberty blocking drugs, sterilizations, even, certainly at the end of the conveyor belt is the full on, surgical interventions. Do they harm? I mean, it's one thing that they don't help, but is the research showing that these things are actually harmful instead?
In some ways, yes. And in some ways, it doesn't matter. In some ways that it harms, certainly, if you give somebody a double mastectomy and they change their minds, well, she's not going to be able to nurse children if she decides to have children. If you castrate somebody, well, that's the end of that. You can't reattach body parts that we've surgically intervened with. If you take a prepubescent child, put them on puberty blockers, then put them on cross-sex hormones, they're going to be sterile for life. We can't reverse that part. So for some situations, for some of these treatments, no, that's permanent. And those are very, very clear harms. The other part, and people forget, even doctors forget this, which stuns me. The rule is, first, do no harm. If you don't know what you're doing, do nothing. The burden of proof is on the other side. The burden of proof is you have to make sure that what you're going to do before surgery, before medications, it's up to them to demonstrate proof that it helps. It's not up to do nothing to prove that do nothing is the better idea. We assume do nothing is the better idea until we have proof that intervening, especially with powerful interventions, is the help. So that's why I say the burden of proof is on the other side. The neutral thing is to do nothing and see how things turn out. The greater the risk of anything we intervene with, the stronger the evidence has to be in order to justify it. When we're not sure that medication is going to do any better than psychotherapy, well, start with psychotherapy. And only as a last resort would we start thinking about the more dramatic interventions. So not having proof that a dramatic intervention that can end with sterility, not having proof is a good enough reason not to do it. We only bring in the heavy guns when we have to.
I mean, that's one of the things that's been so astonishing to watch over the last 5 years is just, prior to these revelations, just how quickly these kind of baseline rules were violated. And this issue was treated in ways that almost nothing else was treated. And it just really something. Last question here to start, Dr. Cantor, and that is, I'm not sure that there's been any kind of follow the science line that has been used more frequently and frankly more manipulatively, especially for parents, than the risk of suicide. The line
Yes.
that we know that if you do not fully affirm, this situation, particularly when we're talking about minors, you are going to be contributing to their suicidality. And of course, the classic line, do you want a living son or a dead daughter or vice versa, whatever the case may be. I mean, I've talked to parents that's the gimme. I mean, they're just like, look, if that's what I'm facing, then I'll do whatever it takes to keep my child alive. And I get that as a parent completely. What do we know now about the risk of suicide, whether we go down this line of, these treatments or not?
The treatments don't help is the
Wow.
bottom line. There's never been any evidence that it helps. something that's now become pretty clear again, pretty recently, is that it's not just kids who are saying they're trans who are in this kind of psychological distress and expressing suicidal ideation or saying that they're attempting suicide. It's a huge proportion of today's entire generation of adolescents, a large portion of which is also saying that they're gender dysphoric. But it's really the thing that's changed is this entire generation that's grown up with social media. So extreme ideas don't seem very extreme to them because they're exposed to it so much, and they circulate in whatever, social media groups where everybody's saying this, so it doesn't seem so unusual to them. And I think part of that has also contributed to the polarization that we're seeing all over society in general now. People are picking what they want to hear, so they hear more of it and don't realize just how extreme they're surrounding themselves with. But now that there's been enough time, we're seeing both levels of reported suicide are higher for that entire generation, gender dysphoric or not, and that transition doesn't help. They stay suicidal, or they still continue to report being very unhappy, even with transition. So as I say, the evidence suggests much more that what we need to be providing now for these kids is the psychotherapy to deal with the distress itself and for the unhealthy messages that are being circulated over social media that used to not be as ubiquitous as they are now.
Well, listen, we're clearly having a national reckoning with social media, and we can thank some authors for pushing that forward and with therapy as well. So, grateful for that. And by the way, I failed to mention that is a great lamp behind your head. I just want to say that is a fantastic lamp. I love it.
Thank you. It's one of my favorites. I found it at an auction up here in Canada.
Oh, it's great. Okay, Dr. Curlin, I want to, Dr. Cantor really teed up the medical ethics side about the do no harm piece, and this is your specialty. This is what you do at Duke, and your book is absolutely spectacular. It is interesting when we talk about that. It's almost like the traditional rules haven't applied in this area. That this is what we hear. That it doesn't matter, even as the science has become obviously misstated, and that folks have been misleading us on the science. We still then say, well, still, it's unethical. It would be unethical to not give these kids what they want. This is what they want. This is what we should give them. And help us think through that. What's your response on the ethical level to that accusation?
I became interested in this topic, John, several years ago, in part because of the work that ended up in that book, The Way of Medicine. It had come to stand out to me that you had within medicine at least two different ways of understanding what medicine is and what it's for, and then corollary understandings of what our obligations are toward patients. The one that we've inherited through the centuries, to which the Hippocratic Reform movement and the Christian era and the Jewish tradition and Islamic medicine, and then much of modern scientific medicine contributed to up until the last couple of generations, we call the way of medicine. And it understands that medicine is for health, that health is a real thing. It's a norm of living things. It's something that you can develop expertise about, the doctors do develop expertise about, and that it has it's something we appreciate, respect, seek to preserve and restore, not something we make up in our minds or just try to innovate on willy-nilly. The other way of understanding medicine that's been growing for some time is what we call the provider of services model. And that really understands medicine as a set of technical capacities that can be put to use to pursue what the patient says is consistent with his or her well-being, where the language of well-being has increasingly substituted for health, and well-being is used in a way that's strictly subjective, where ultimately, if a person says that for them, for me, for my life, for my values, for my health, for my well-being, this thing is needed, then we have an obligation to provide it. And it struck me when I heard about gender transition, and particularly medicalized gender transition for minors, that this was the sine qua non of the provider of services model. And I will say, John, I came all the way through training, and I did one of the premier fellowships in clinical medical ethics at the University of Chicago, and I had never heard of medicalized gender transition for minors. That's how new this is. And now it's practically every pediatrician I talk to says this is one of the most difficult things they confront. Mental health practitioners say that's what the most difficult things they confront. So the key problem right off the bat that struck me is that here you have a situation in which we are taking our historic, scientific, objective understanding of what a healthy person of a certain age and sex looks like, what kinds of secondary sex characteristics, as we call them, are developed, what their hormonal levels are, and so on, and completely ignoring that in favor of the perception of the person who is experiencing real discomfort for reasons that are complicated. But I mean, it's real discomfort, but their perception that their body is somehow out of alignment with their true identity. And as physicians, we are taking our tools up and doing to the body things that are objectively, it seems to me, contrary to the patient's health. And as James was saying earlier, have potentially irreversible damaging consequences, all in service to a perception. That just seemed to me really at odds with the way of medicine, with how medicine's traditionally been understood. And it seems doubly problematic when it's involving children, for whom we've always had a higher level within the profession of medicine. We've always understood we have a higher level of fiduciary obligations to only act in ways that are consistent with that child's health, reasonably and objectively understood, and to not let our own desires to do things that are interesting and creative lead us to harm children with therapies that are unproven, and particularly not with therapies like this that are, it's not might they help, but they directly harm, but they directly harm by blocking their healthy development of sexual capacity and reproductive capacity.
I said we were going to follow the medicine and talk, more kind of scientifically here, but what you just said, I just couldn't help, from a theological and philosophical vantage point here, that this is really seeing the body as not really being the same thing as someone's person, right? It's kind of separating the true self as this kind of inner voice or this inner spirit, or I don't even know what you would call it, but this kind of inner set of subjective desires. And then the body kind of becomes a canvas. It becomes pliable. It can become whatever, we want. And so when you talk about kind of the original idea, which is really pushing someone towards health, if you don't assume that the body's an essential part of who somebody is, then you're just rearranging what a healthy body is, whatever matches this person. That's the real person. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
it's really a
philosophical
set of gymnastics happening here.
It's a philosophical set of obvious contradictions, it seems to me. And these are the kind of contradictions that are so conspicuous that I think highlights, to me, it helps to explain why there's such vitriolic attempt to suppress dissent within the professional realm. Because if we actually reason about it publicly, if we start to say, well, let's just consider the question. What's the logic here? What would have to be true for this idea to be true? These things fall apart. So just very briefly, some of the obvious contradictions. Some people will say that that there's no such thing as sex, or that, and then if that's true, of course, it's very strange to try to change the secondary sex characteristics, to match something that doesn't really matter. Or they'll this idea that you have a real self, as you were just suggesting, that is somehow separable from that living thing that's in front of the person looking at you. That John Stonestreet is somehow separable from this embodied person, this creature, this human creature that's right here. That's not philosophically plausible. And then the one that touches on the kind of moral drive of this, which is that we need to affirm. I mean, the language used within the medical realm and the pediatrics world is gender affirmation therapy. Mm-hmm. But how strange it is, and to me paradoxical and contradictory it is, that the way we're told to affirm a child is to basically take up tools to change the child, right? We're going to affirm you by treating the body that is you as if there's something terribly wrong with it that we must change. There are a number of philosophical and theological contradictions that underlie this practice.
And to affirm is somehow to try to convert, right? To affirm that somebody was born in the right body, then is called conversion therapy on the other side. And it's just upside down completely.
Yes, I agree. Yes.
But Dr. Cantor, I want to come back to you. We mentioned just quickly the cast review, and I want to get to that too. But one of the big things that happened this year was, of course, these revealed communications from WPATH. Now, WPATH stands for the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. I don't want to be too cynical here, but as I looked at them when this story broke, it was like, here's a group of people that got together and kind of crowned themselves experts on this. And it's kind of like, well, how do you know you're right? Because we're experts. How do you know you're experts? Because we're right. I mean, it really seemed to be a self-referential authority structure in this group. So I won't let you, you don't have to be guilty of saying that. I'll say it out loud. I was confused. Okay.
The way that I often describe it is one person's panel of experts is another person's old boys network.
That's really what it seemed like. There was this kind of back and forth. Okay, well, look, a lot of these internal emails and communications came out, and it really kind of contained damning evidence that claims that they had made weren't substantiated, that things that people were questioning, and they said the science is settled. They admitted the science wasn't settled. How big was this in terms of kind of this new moment we're sensing where, kind of the walls are crumbling or the foundation's cracking in this movement?
It provided the smoking gun. To those of us following the science, we knew that what they were saying, the contents of their press releases, the claims being made on social media and so on, we knew it just didn't match up with the science. It simply made no sense. We also knew already, just by who was selected to be in the committees, these were all people in a florid conflict of interest. The people who were in charge of writing whether or not we think this is a good idea were the doctors in charge of the clinics who get paid for providing exactly that service. Well, if that were legitimate, then the only way you could find out if psychics are real is you have to get together a committee of psychics. Only the psychics are allowed to. It absolutely makes no sense. It's the way evidence-based medicine works. And, literally every major, even the minor, medical associations have all adopted and recognized that, evidence-based medicine is the way to go. But what we had was WPATH claiming to be following the evidence. And yet once, their internal communications then became, available for scrutiny, not only did they not follow it, they knew they were not following it. It's now, we now can see, a very, very clear intent that this was a big sales job where they didn't have the evidence. They knew they didn't have the evidence and made claims exactly contrary to what the reality was. So where before it was, if one can excuse the term, it was no longer just a he said, she said kind of an argument. We actually now have copies of their diaries saying that they knew this all along.
Wow. What was the scope of their influence? Or what is the scope of this organization's influence?
Until the early 2000s, until 2010-ish, there were only very, very few clinics and experts who were able to work in this area at all. Genuine transsexuality was exquisitely rare, and among children, nearly unheard of. So there really was only one professional group that started legitimately scientific. It was the various scientists and clinicians working on the issue would get together, trade notes, compare what they were finding out to each other. They were the ones doing the science, so they would share it with each other. As I say, when the group started in the 70s, it was a legitimate scientific group with a big unknown, doing the best they could do with what they had. But over time, that stopped being true. They then started, members started becoming, there were more enthusiasts rather than neutral and dispassionate and objective scientists, and it became an activist organization. So it really shifted its focus, but depended on and relied upon its reputation for having followed the science, but no longer could actually present the science. They just said, well, we're known for presenting the science, therefore this is scientific. But that wasn't it. Everything became about perception. But because they were the only group focused on it, other groups of endocrinologists and psychologists and so on just kind of automatically deferred to them, knowing, well, we don't know. They know because they're supposed to be the experts, so we'll just endorse what they say, or we'll just follow what they say. So when WPATH really started becoming an activist and political organization instead of an actual scientific organization, none of the other groups were doing their due diligence to double check what was being said by WPATH. And so none of them, they didn't even try or think to try to question what was coming out. And so it just caught on. And then it became this one great big domino circle. Yeah. Everybody was saying it because, well, that's what everybody else is saying. But nobody was actually double checking how it started and where these stories came from and what the original science was. So,
yeah, it's just stunning when you look back and you look at the level of complicity here from media personalities, from research universities, from thought leaders, from social media influencers, and then the job that it did on moms and dads. This corruption goes so deep, and it goes back to everything we said at the very beginning. We were told this would help, didn't help. We were told it wouldn't harm, it harmed. We were told these things aren't reversible, they're reversible. Or these things are reversible, they're not reversible. We were told that there was a suicide at risk, not true. It was just one thing after another. Dr. Curlin, let me talk to you about one specific statement that I thought was just really powerful. It was from a pediatric endocrinologist. This came out in this whole set of communications that became public. He said, most of the kids are nowhere in any kind of a brain space to really, really, really talk about it in a serious way. Now, what he's talking about there is particularly kind of choosing this future where they're affecting their, future fertility, their ability to be a mom or a dad. And basically this guy is admitting, we're talking about 11, 12-year-olds at the, or younger. They've never thought about making a decision now, which says I'll never be a dad or I'll never be, and in fact, they can. But that's exactly what we were told, is that this was a group of people that know themselves and that doctors have to, respect what a child wants. So it's also, to go to your inconsistencies, like, isn't this all of our sexual ethics now to be about consent anyway? Like, I mean, that's how we've kind of reduced down sexual ethics to nothing more than consent. Basically, he admitted these kids can't consent to this. So how is this not like a big social experimentation on these kids?
Yeah, I think you're putting your finger on one of the areas where common sense, I think, raises very glaring questions. I mean, if you've been in the world very long, certainly if you've had your own children go through adolescence, if you've ever gone through adolescence, you know that to go through adolescence is confusing, stressful, difficult, and involves a lot of sexual impulses, wild ideas, confusing ideas. And the notion that all of a sudden the experts can tell you that children in adolescence, who most of whom, as James was saying earlier, in this current new cohort, didn't have whatever feelings they're having now, even a year or two before, now say, I identify that I am these secondary sex characteristics that I have are at odds with who I am, and they must be changed. And we're to take that seriously. I mean, that just on its face runs against all kinds of human common sense. As it turns out, but one might say, well, that may be common sense, but the scientific experts know better. As it turns out, the scientific experts didn't know better. And the ethical principle that we don't allow children, because they are immature, not adequately developed, to have authority to do so. We don't allow them to make their own decisions about medical interventions, and particularly not about medical interventions that have grave consequences, has been well established in medicine forever. Is not something taught by a bunch of conservatives. It's what everybody's been taught. It's what the American Academy of Pediatrics itself teaches in its own documents on pediatric ethics.
Wow.
That children generally do not have authority to make medical decisions. And in fact, in every state, they don't have that authority, apart from a few carve-outs, things called basically emancipation, which is a legal category for some kids. So it runs against common sense. It runs against the traditions of medicine and the standards that we follow in every other situation except this one. And then it's even made worse by the fact that, as the data has made crystal clear in these studies from European nations that are able to follow all the people in their society because they have these large national health systems, have made this crystal clear. The children who are presenting with gender dysphoria have a very high rate of comorbid, as we say, mental illnesses and challenges. They have anxiety, they have depression, they have ADHD. Many of them have autism spectrum disorder issues. A high degree of them report that they've been sexually abused. I mean, these are kids that are struggling, lots of them. And we take immaturity and mental illness, which itself has long been known to make us reasonably question whether even an adult has capacity to give consent to an intervention that has grave consequences. All that together means it seems to me grossly contrary to the central principles of medical ethics to allow this to be done to children.
You know, I hadn't even put that into this statement from this, WPATH person who, basically admits that there's no such thing as consent. But in our first forum back in January, and our guest at that time, Steve Gersovich, who's a psychologist who's really dealt a lot helping families who have children with autism. And he really started to see the targeting of these families and these children with this ideology and the number of comorbidities. But he offered a presentation where he pointed to some of these comorbidities of children, adolescents, pre-adolescents who struggle with gender dysphoria to some degree, and how many of them also have something like schizophrenia or, clinically diagnosable depression or autism or something. The numbers were off the charts. I mean, it was absolutely stunning. So we certainly wouldn't allow, I won't say a normal, but a child without any of these comorbidities to self-diagnose. But we're actually allowing children with all these these comorbidities to do that. That seems even more just. I mean, it's just sometimes when what's happened this year for me, Dr. Curlin, is like the curtains come back, and it's just incredulous. It's just hard to believe we got this far down the rabbit hole, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. It's hard to believe. It's hard to believe the mental illnesses that go along with this. What's happening when you think, well, how could people rationalize this? Well, the way it's rationalized is, see, these kids really are suffering because they're really transgender, and the reason they're depressed and the reason they're anxious and the reason they won't leave their room is because the world is hostile and bigoted toward transgender kids, and they're not being adequately affirmed. We need to do this intervention out of compassion. And I think the people doing it, we should acknowledge many of them are probably motivated by sincere compassion for kids and wanting to help them. And they're thinking, if we do this, then that's going to relieve all this distress. but the data are crystal clear from all the major studies that have been scientifically conducted in a way that allows them to give us reliable conclusions that it does not reduce these mental health issues. They end up keeping these mental health issues and often adding more. And now they've had all the damage on top of that.
Well, just one more thing about the damage there, Dr. Cantor. I know that there's some connections too that have been revealed between specifically puberty blocking drugs and brain development that now we know. Describe what we now know about that.
It's almost a cliche to say, well, brain development is complicated. It's not just a matter of, it's not like growing taller, add testosterone, take away testosterone, and you'll grow, an inch or two taller or an inch or two shorter. It's a complicated series of, and when this part of the brain is up to this point, it interacts with these set of hormones. And when it's at that developmental stage, so when you prevent puberty, you have a person where parts of their brain are 14 years old and parts are still 10 years old. So when you restart the parts that have been held back, they don't interact in the same way that they otherwise would have. So even though we get people saying, well, we give these drugs, we give puberty blockers to kids with precocious puberty, kids who something is off and they start puberty at 4, 5, 6 years old. So we hold off their puberty on purpose until about 10 years old. But that's very different of starting that medication at 10 years old and holding it off for 4 years. So we're throwing off balance the ordering and the, if I can say biologic, if I can talk to DNA or give DNA its own mind, what it's expecting will be there so that the interactions happen in the biologically correct order. And we have zero evidence on how this will affect them long-term. IQ testing, the balance of different skills, strengths, and weaknesses in the brain. We just don't know. It's never been studied. We've only studied kids with precocious puberty where we're preventing those long-term damage, but not when somebody is biologically at a usual regular stage of puberty and holding it until, as late as we can. So a large chunk of it is we don't know. Yeah. And we're starting to see some evidence of something isn't quite the same. If, for example, it makes a person more likely to develop, I'm making this up, hypothesizing, Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, well, we're not going to know that until the person's in their 50s. Wow. We just don't know.
I mean, wow. Okay. Last question here, and I want to get to the questions, which have you, as you might have guessed, have been pouring in, and great questions as well. But I do want to note something that I think is really, really important. But both of you are in positions where to be as articulate and clear and outspoken against this kind of scientific development, this chapter in medical history, I mean, comes at a great risk. You had to have kind of counted the cost, I guess, to some degree about speaking out. And Dr. Curlin, let me start with you. What are the risks of speaking out as you in the academic space in particular, which you represent here, and why did you choose to do it anyway?
John, I want to say I'm at Duke University here. I'm a professor of medicine and medical humanities, and I was at the University of Chicago before that. And I'm grateful that both universities have been very good to me. I have not been treated poorly in either place. That being said, I have observed that there is something like terror among my colleagues, many of them, about speaking up about the real concerns that they share about the ethics of medicalized gender transition, particularly for kids. I have been in context with groups of leading bioethicists where closed door, where many people mentioned that there are lots of concerns that they still have. And these are people across the ideological spectrum with respect to politics and religion and so on. But, and there's a kind of consensus, but it's it's a very hostile environment to speak up. They don't want to see students marching outside their classrooms. They're afraid that they won't be invited to give a talk at other universities because they'll become noted as someone who is anti-trans, which of course neither Dr. Cantor nor I are anti-trans people. And they are worried that they won't get promoted, that, you know, academic context, universities, the last couple of years have made crystal clear, are subject to politics and to ideological shifts and to public opinion shifts, and have not done a great job of sustaining civil discourse, particularly around areas that put people's teeth on edge. And this is one of them. So there's a real problem there. And I will say this has been noted by our European colleagues. It's noted in the Cass report. It's noted by Dr. Cass in a number of interviews, noted by colleagues leading in Finland, Sweden, and other places, that people are attacked often if they speak up. And they're even attacked within the transgender community if they speak up and say, hey, this seems to be going too far. So there's a stifling environment, unfortunately. I spoke up because let me be honest, I have little courage, but and I have tenure at Duke University. And it seemed to me, I remember thinking, Far, you really believe there are serious problems with this, and you know lots of others do too, and they're not speaking up, and you have tenure, and you're a medical ethicist, you have an obligation to speak up. And so I started to speak up. And I will say, the only time I've been overtly canceled from giving a lecture was because some students at a university that had invited me found out that I had criticized medicalized gender transition, and, you know, mounted a campaign to have my lecture canceled.
Wow. Dr. Cantor, I mentioned before that, you know, on a worldview level, we don't line up, but, you know, across the board on a number of things. And it's also clear that, you know, the members of the, you know, the LGBTQIA acronym don't all see this the same, you know, as well. So you have done this at great risk as well, or, you know, definitely had to count the cost going forward. Why do you think it's so important for medical professionals, especially in the field that you work in, to speak up like this?
I think it's important exactly to prevent. We've seen this before. Pick your medical disaster: thalidomide, OxyContin, shaken baby syndrome, recovered memory syndrome. Fads now and then hit the clinical groups, medical, psychological, take your pick. And for each one of these, the same thing went wrong. It wasn't the 2% of any group are crazy, because 2% of any group are crazy. Those 2% only catch on if 98% are cowards. If nobody speaks up and says, hang on a second, those 2% aren't recognized as 2%. It sounds like everybody, because the rational majority are keeping quiet, and social media exaggerates it. So really, it's if you don't want to repeat the great disasters of the clinical professions, I couldn't sleep at night if I knew actually what was going on and kept my mouth shut anyway. The top 3 reasons that this particular controversy or disaster is going on, the top 3 reasons are perception, perception, perception. The kids who want to transition, do they really think they're the other sex, or do they just want to be perceived as the other sex because they're unhappy with themselves, they hate their own bodies, so I want to be perceived as something different? So they go to a doctor, they can go doctor shopping. They will pick the doctor who will say yes because the doctor is going to say yes, because they think of how that is going to influence how they're perceived. they want to be seen as good or as politically liberal or whatever it is that is important to them. And then we have the other 98% keeping quiet because they're protecting their perception and how they're going to look. And it's that perfect storm of situations that allows things to have gotten as far as they have.
Well, I appreciate you both. Thanks for answering that question the way that you did, just sincerely that way. And we, as you can see, have just a flurry of questions, and we want to get to those as quickly as possible. I want to give folks another chance if they want to go ahead and send in a question to do that. Just as you guys are thinking about what else you want to talk about, we're going to just take a quick break and tell you about a resource that's very, very important. The Colson Center this past year worked with a couple dozen other organizations to produce a set of video teaching on the topic of identity. So sexuality, our understanding of gender, the understanding of the theological concept of the image of God, marriage, family, and all of that. It's called the Identity Project. And we want to share with you how you can get access to those videos right now. And as we do that and watch this, go ahead and type in any additional questions that you have, and we'll be back to tackle as many of them as possible.
We need to stand on solid ground, to stand on the truth.
We want to be grounded in, again, we are made in the image of God, and we go back to that.
Freedom is not rejecting restraint, but embracing the right restraints about the world we live in and the bodies that God has given us.
I also love that we're talking about being created male and female, and we're not even talking about sexual love yet.
Exactly.
But we have to start here.
They're being taught this everywhere. They're being taught about gender all the time, except in the church.
And we need to get back to biblical standards and convictional Christianity when it comes to sexual purity, not cultural Christianity.
Before we tell them how to behave, we need to help them understand who they are.
We'll need a theology of the body that goes beyond these topics and actually helps us recover a more comprehensive sense of what it means to be embodied.
Our culture tells us that our gender reflects ourselves. But the Bible tells us that our gender reflects our Creator.
You can change your attitudes and you can change your beliefs. You don't have to change your gender.
So-called gender transition surgery. What happens to children like that 20 or 30 years from now? We simply don't know.
I struggled with my own transgender identity. But the longer that you go down this road, the more you are desperate for this to be real.
This has been part of my own story, wrestling with same-sex attraction at various points.
Society at the moment is living out what Scripture says will happen.
Many of my colleagues in child psychiatry share my concerns about this. They're afraid to speak out.
The real question is, what do we do with that? How do parents contend with this?
When it comes to children and talking about sex, questions can feel embarrassing or uncomfortable. But as parents, we want to meet them in those places.
It takes many years for parents to teach the kids right and wrong.
The best way to protect children from deception is to teach them the truth.
Sex is objectified, made to just be about bodies, but we know God created it to be so much more.
Everybody has some baggage with regards to sexual sin.
Another thing we have to do better is effectively prepare people for marriage.
Marriage, as God designed it, was perfect. One man, one woman for life.
If marriage civilizes men, then we've never lived at a time in our history where there's more uncivilized men walking the streets of our communities.
What I'm suggesting is that we do this more thoughtfully, more intentionally.
I'm feeling a lot more optimistic, Maria, because things are starting to change.
We can do this better. We can do this better, even today.
All right. Well, we are back, and I really appreciate these thoughtful questions. And doctors, we have our work cut out for us. We got 30 minutes to work through here as much as we possibly can. We have a handful of questions around just the hormonal treatments. Somebody talked about a family member, a sister receiving testosterone for 3 years, and he's watched how it's changed, not just her body, but also her attitude, her aggressiveness, that sort of thing. And then also for a non-related condition, a man receiving estrogen as part of a treatment for prostate cancer, and how it affected. And it does seem that there's a comfort level. Somebody asked about that too, of altering our bodies with chemicals, maybe that folks have. Could you maybe be a little more specific on what we know in terms of the long-term consequences of particularly estrogen, testosterone, but any of the other hormones that are given particularly to minors? Dr. Cantor, you want to tackle that one first?
Yes and no. A lot of what we know is really relative to other options. A way that I often describe the situation is we often have a difficult choice between bad options. There are 4 parts to all of these decisions. We don't decide something is safe or not, and we don't decide something is effective or not. We decide, are the risks worth the benefits? We have to decide those 2 things together. We can tolerate weak evidence of benefit if the risks are very low. But if the risks are very high, then we need very solid evidence of benefit. The other parts that that we need are, what are the uncertainties? You know, what's left? If we have a blood test so we can be very sure that person has whatever condition is, okay, now we can go through the treatments with a certain level of confidence. But if we were just guessing what the diagnosis was in the first place, then we have to be that much more cautious. And the other one are the alternatives. Sometimes, you know, a risk can be worth it when we have no choice. There are no alternatives. But if we have an alternative with a better risk to benefit ratio, all of a sudden it's not so acceptable. So all 4 of these things have to be balanced at exactly the same time. For what do we know about the long-term harms? Giving estrogen to an adult is not the same as giving an estrogen to a child. The effects on the developing brain are not the same as the effects on an adult brain that has already completed that process. The same with puberty blockers. Puberty, well, in an adult, you're not blocking puberty. It's already done. So the effect of the medication on children is entirely different. The only times we use those puberty blocking drugs in adults is when they have cancer, which is a testosterone sensitive cancer like prostate cancer, or with sex offenders where we're chemically castrating them. So the effects on a child, so we would use those medications on an adult, otherwise they will die of cancer. So the risks of not doing it are much, much greater than with a child, where the risks are going to grow a beard, which will interfere with their cosmetic preference. Well, cosmetic reasons aren't quite the same as otherwise you have a fatal illness. So it's not just a matter of, you know, what the long-term effects are. We have to balance all of those parts at the same time. But what we do know is long-term use, the greatest interferences are with bone density, which sometimes can be made up, sometimes not. But we don't know about what happens in old age when the bone density is again decreasing. And the other one are various cardiovascular disorders, which again are the things that the disorders and diseases that males get more often than biological females. Again, people become more sensitive to when they're on long-term cross-sex hormones.
Doctor, you want to add to that, Dr. Curlin?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, it's absolutely right. You have to think about risks and benefits. I said earlier, you know, medicine has operated throughout its history with a presumption that the healthy human organism has a kind of integrity that medicine is trying to preserve. And there are some cautionary tales where humans think, hey, now that we can kind of raise one of those things in us that seems to do good things, let's do that. So, for example, in the Women's Health Initiative, a large study of about 50,000 women over multiple years that followed all kinds of things, people thought, hey, estrogen, since women have lower risk of heart disease, let's give everybody estrogen when they're going to hitting menopause, when estrogen normally drops, and then they'll be even healthier. And after several years, they realize, whoa, we're creating excess cancers of various sorts that are actually outstripping the numbers of heart attacks we're preventing. And so that now that's not characteristically done unless you have other medical reasons that warrant giving estrogen. Similarly with testosterone, testosterone leads to muscle mass, and that's led to some of the controversy about sports, transgender persons in sports. So of course, a lot of men like to be muscular, and they think, hey, let's give ourselves let's add that more testosterone, more strength. Well, yeah, that's true, but then a lot of other things come along with that: acne, worse heart disease, heart failure, and things like that. So we have no idea, as James said, long term, what the effects of this is going to be on this cohort of young people, because this has never been done before. But we have plenty of cautionary tales from the history of medicine that should lead us to not be surprised if the consequences are bad.
Great answer. Question here: is there a Christian law firm building class action lawsuits against high schools, colleges, or medical institutions? And it's interesting. I just saw Kristen Wagoner, the CEO of ADF, describe on an episode of Dr. Phil that, and in her words, scores of parents reaching out to ADF saying that they believe that their children were being pushed into transitioning without them knowing. And of course, I actually met a couple from Michigan this year that told that story. So obviously, to answer that question, I'll just do that quickly. ADF can get you in touch with that. There is a law firm that actually is specifically dealing with detransitioners, and that's something that's interestingly not come up here. And so maybe there are a bunch of questions. So there's my transition. There's a law firm that's been formed down in I believe it's in Austin, Texas. And I'm looking for the name of that law firm. I'll see if I can find it. But the attorney is Josh Payne, is one of the partners in that law firm, and they're just dealing with the detransitioners. And I want to talk about the detransitioners. You know, on so many of these issues in society, there are people that aren't supposed to exist. You know, women who regret their abortion, not supposed to exist. Folks who come to Christ and embrace a biblical sexual ethic. They're not supposed to exist, and yet they do. This is one of those groups of people that aren't supposed to exist. Folks that have gone down, especially young people, and then realized, I wasn't born in the wrong body. I was born in the right body, and we have a lot more of that. Could either of you kind of speak to the kind of co-option of schools, certainly counseling offices and others that have push children down there? And then what is the scope and scale of the detransitioners now that we are seeing?
I kind of want to give one great big, we don't know.
Okay.
But it's even worse. It's one great big, we're being prevented from seeing.
So we don't know, and it's not an accident. We don't know.
That's pretty much it. A lot of the people going through it are themselves embarrassed and ashamed of it. Or all of a sudden, the people going through it, again, these are still people who have had a large set of mental health concerns. They were vulnerable to social fads. They were depending on this to fix all their problems, and it didn't. So not only do they still not have a healthy social network, which is what made them vulnerable to begin with, but the network that they did develop of other activists and groups, now they're being shunned even from that. You know, they're being, dismissed as a traitor to that cause, which can make things even worse. And people don't, when somebody, a general practitioner, a gender specialist, whatever that is, an endocrinologist, when they decide that, no, this was a mistake and they're going to stop, people don't tend to make appointments and go to the doctor to tell the doctor that I'm not coming back anymore. They just stop seeing the doctor. So the statistics, especially in the US, just are not being gathered. So there are no activists demanding that these kinds of numbers be gathered. And unlike Europe, as Dr. Curlin pointed out, the US doesn't have a centralized system where we can analyze the epidemiology of a situation. So it is, as I say, one great big unknown, and the large establishments who are providing these services that may be doing harm, they don't want to know. They're in trouble if the answer is yes. They have no motivation to find out.
Yeah, and John, I'll just add a couple notes, because I think this is one of the areas where there are glaring logical contradictions and contradictions with respect to ethics. One of the ideas that underlies and undergirds the project of medicalized gender transition is that gender identity is stable. It is intrinsic. It may take a child a while to realize it, but it is a thing that's in them. It's not something that's shifting and changing, we are told to believe. We've always known that wasn't quite right, because as Dr. Cantor knows better than I, people have followed that small minority of children that in the past have expressed that they're the opposite sex, and noted that most of them, if you you're just patient with them and they go through puberty, will come to terms with their own sex and live in a way that's congruent with their sex. So we've seen that change. But here you have with detransitioners, you have people who are saying, you said it doesn't change, but it's changed. And then here you see the double contradiction. We're supposed to affirm people in their self-perceived gender, even when it means treating the rest of their healthy body as if it were unhealthy. And yet when they detransition, we're not supposed to affirm them? I mean, that seems like a gross contradiction and a gross injustice to the people who have experienced this harm.
I think, just speaking quickly, it's an incredible opportunity for the church to surround these folks as well and to help them. And this is going to be kind of, our forefathers in the faith ran into the plague and not away from it. And there's going to have to be some of that for us too. The law firm that is specifically working with detransitioners is called Campbell, Miller, and Payne. The attorney that I've met is named Josh Payne. Met one of his clients this summer. Just really a remarkable story. They have, including fascinating, tragically, two families of detransitioners that they're representing in wrongful death lawsuits. So this is a group of very successful attorneys that have basically come together to take on these cases specifically. So just, you talk about a ministry and a calling altogether, really fantastic. And then the question about law firms representing parents against schools, ADF is absolutely tackling those cases and have done that already in more than a number of cases. We've got a number of questions having to do with two things, and I want to pull them together because there is a little bit of, I think, chronology to this. Dr. Cantor, you mentioned social media. It really does seem that the world's having a reckoning now with that. The number of schools and number of states really who have basically said in our schools, we are limiting phone use. It's just, you're going to put it in a magnetic bag when you come in. You're not going to get it until you leave. And there's a real, I think, acknowledgement when you see of the number of, you mentioned that this changed. You saw this issue change dramatically 10 or so years ago. And one of the changes is from grown men struggling with their gender identity to teenage girls and pre-adolescent girls, and an incredible number of that. And so the overlay of social media. So I'm going to give you both a chance to kind of talk about that and what you would recommend then to parents in light of what we now know, but also COVID. And of course, we know COVID lockdown sent kids home, put them in front of screens that increased attention maybe to some of these sites, and how we thought about COVID and how we thought about schools. Do either of you see that as a related issue in terms of the explosion of the number of young people in particular that report this sort of distress?
Yes and no. The common thread, I think, through each of the ingredients to this problem has been, we're social creatures. We require social contact. We require eye contact. And social media and the games, and phones haven't brought people together. Phones are standing in between people. Rather than make eye contact, tell jokes, and play whatever games, families over a dinner table, groups of kids in the neighborhood playing whatever game together, they're not. When they're physically together, they're mentally in different places because everybody's on their phone and worried about how they look in whatever picture it is. So it's one thing with adults who are kind of, relatively set, I'll say, in their interactions. It's different with kids who are at that point are still learning how to socially interact. I often describe it like learning a language. If you learn that language when you're young, you speak it like a native speaker, you speak it perfectly fluently. You can't do that once you're an adult. You learn the language as an adult, you will have an accent and you will struggle with it. Same with social contact, eye contact, mannerisms, learning how to read other people, learning how to give social signals. If you don't learn that when you're still young, you're not going to learn it. You will speak it with an accent. And it's so really the biggest problem that that technology has done is displace the healthy interaction, the awkward, the silly, all of the stuff that we go through as kids. They're not going through as kids. They're not learning how to manage it at the time when our brains are geared towards learning social interaction. And so that's so whether schools do it by banning phones or encouraging situations where kids can physically interact, yeah, that's how we are. That's how brains work. That's the environment in which we evolved. And that's what we need to be that's what we need to be encouraging. COVID only added to that because, again, it made people separate. So we needed to try that much harder to create other situations to provide that kind of an environment.
Yeah. So you're a fan of the bans of cell phones, though, and schools to, at minimum.
It's certainly a very good idea. Again, we haven't studied those specifically, but it's certainly in line with what we know about human development.
Okay. Dr. Curlin?
And John, just briefly, people who have watched this phenomenon and are trying to make sense of it have noticed that where kids who end up in adolescence presenting as having gender dysphoria, where they're finding their people and finding people who affirm them and encourage them and give them tips and give them guidance and give them a playbook sort of how this works is online.
Yeah.
And I think, you can get it. We all know online, there are all these echo chambers where people can feel like they belong and they find people who affirm whatever they're being drawn toward, and they can have a power of its own.
Just again, this is anecdotal, but I think, there's plenty of data to support what you just said. I've interviewed 2 detransitioners, 3 detransitioners, and in every case, that was true, that the vast majority of the information, even the initial idea that this is even an option, and then how do I, talk to my parents or not talk to my parents? How do I hide it? All this advice was coming from online, quote unquote experts, most of them not experts. And so it is just a really vulnerable thing to see kind of the scientific and medical community kind of bow down to it. And that's the next set of questions that I want to get to, because I mentioned earlier, I got to the point mid-year, I'm just like incredulous. Like it's so obvious. How did we get here? And, there's a question here of, look, if this medical data now is so obvious, if the science is so clear, then why is it that there are still medical associations in the United States in particular that would say you guys are wrong, that you're misleading? And, there was another version of that question that said, what do you say when someone says, well, I'll give you 50 papers that says the opposite or whatever? The answer to that is, okay, give me the 50 papers. That's the easy, answer to that. But there is, especially in America, a stubbornness of the medical community, particularly corners of the medical community, to even second guess this at all. So do you see the same thing, or do you see that there really is a reckoning happening? B, can you explain that stubbornness? And then C, what do we do about it? What can you guys do about it? What can we do about it? Easy questions, you know, a really simple set of questions there.
I'll take this first, if I may. It is a problem. I recently wrote a piece and shared it on a national bioethics listserv with colleagues nationally to say, hey guys, why is there such silence of bioethics on medicalized gender transition? Look at the CAS report from England. Look at what's happening in Europe. Look at the disclosures of bad behavior on the part of WPATH. Look at the fact that this seems pretty obviously to violate norms that we think hold in other contexts. Why aren't we having conferences? Why aren't we having arguments in public? And, you know, there was crickets in response to that, because I think, again, people are scared. I did get a number of emails from colleagues, again, across the ideological spectrum, saying, thank you for speaking up. This is a stifling environment. I don't feel like I could speak up, but please do. And so I'd say that's to take your third question, that's what we can do, is just respectfully speak up. Say, you know, people say the emperor's new clothes are really beautiful, but he looks naked. You know, I mean, just speak the obvious. And I will say, I am encouraged that I think it is starting to break up, and we are seeing what I hope will soon be the unraveling of this wayward project of medicalized gender transition. And I think the evidence for that is the New York Times. If people have been following, you know, the New York Times is generally a reliable exponent of kind of cosmopolitan, liberal, progressive opinion. And since late 2023, they have had a number of pieces by diverse authors saying, hey, you know, there seems to be some problems here. And there seems to be, in the US, seems to be not talking about the things that the rest of the world is talking about. There's a piece earlier this summer, I'm blanking on her name right now, Pamela Paul, if people want to Google it, just look it up and you will see it listing all of the kinds of problems and saying effectively, why is the field suppressing dialogue about this? I think the fact that the New York Times is publishing those kinds of pieces suggests that people can't keep all this information in. And I'm hoping soon we will see people start to speak up and say, yeah, we never should have done that in the first place.
Yeah. Dr. Cantor, you want to jump on that question as well?
People aren't going to like the answer, but I'm a dual citizen, Canadian and American. I have lived a large chunk of my life in the American healthcare system, and I have lived a large part of my life in a national healthcare system. The difference between the US and the rest of the world, all of the countries in Europe which have stuck to the basic principles of evidence-based medicine, ran their systematic reviews to, you know, come to unbiased conclusions, all came to the same conclusion. This doesn't help, and the evidence of harm is substantial. Even though we keep hearing all of the major American medical systems have approved and endorsed this, not a single one of the American medical associations have engaged in the usual processes of a systematic review leading to evidence-based medicine. And it's hard to shake the obvious hypothesis because a public healthcare system acts in the best interests of the public. A medical association acts in the best interest of the doctors. Calling something experimental means insurance doesn't cover it. So nobody will call it experimental in the US. We have in the US the wolf in charge of the hen house. So everybody keeps it shut, keeps their mouths shut. A great deal of the opposition coming from American medical associations is not about endorsing transition as much as it is resisting government regulation. If we allow the government to pass a law that says doctors can't, do these procedures, well, then that might be a slippery slope to other regulations. And so the various medical associations are opposing regulation of doctors. And this just happens to be the issue of the moment.
That's a really interesting idea. I mean, there's no question that when it comes to, for example, groups like Planned Parenthood, they have been able to find a good profit center in the distribution of testosterone or other, some of these medications, and to do so very quickly and to act like the science is settled to do so very quickly. It is, I think it's worth saying, I don't think Canada has backed off of this to the same degree that we've seen like Belgium or,
Sweden and Finland.
So it can't just be the kind of the public system versus the non-public system, at least over there. There certainly is an awful lot of politics driving that system, but the profit motive is there. There's no question about it. I appreciate you saying that. I think it needs to be highlighted. There is a profit motive here.
John, can I say something briefly?
Sure.
I think it's important to take a step back and think, how did we end up with this? And to look a little bit at the cultural roots. I saw in the banner before we began, Carl Trueman's book, and the book that a lot of people have heard about is The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which begins with asking the question, how is it we end up in a culture where the sentence, "This is a man and a woman's body," makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
And he traces out how part of the modernity and liberalism as a project is to free the self from constraints, external, the constraints of tradition, the constraints of politics, the constraints of all kinds of things. And that's good insofar as those constraints are really oppressing a person's flourishing and limiting their genuine freedom. But the logic of it has continued to advance through the language of autonomy and choice and so on. And I think that the gender dysphoria and gender transition phenomenon shows the logic taken to the point where it becomes absurd. So now we have people seeing their own bodies as somehow contrary to and oppressive of their true selves, such that they want to escape the oppressive influence of their bodies in order to be themselves. And of course, it's tragic because you can't do that. And so you're going to end up in trying to change your body, you're only attacking yourself. And I think it's no wonder that we see such high rates of mental health problems in people who are experiencing this. They're hurting.
Yeah. Well, and that's, of course, St. Augustine's line about sin, right? Incurvatus sin. Sin curves in on itself. It's a self-damaging thing. Paul writes about this in the New Testament. He who sins, you sin sexually, you sin against your own body. There's a self-destructive nature about this. And I think that that's important to notice. I also think, and again, I think this isn't a question, but I do want to say it. I think it's important to say that there are an awful lot of adults that have a strong vested interest in this ideology going forward. And I'm thinking of just a very profound statement. A British psychologist said this, that, if a parent really encouraged or helped usher or embraced and affirmed full transition, when I mean, in quotes, they're medical and surgical, for that parent to admit that they were wrong and allowed their child to harm themselves, I mean, that's going to be really hard for them to do. And I also think that, we see, even to your point earlier, Dr. Cantor, adult men encouraging this on social media, drag queens, kind of the more traditional group that would have had this issue. But they seem to have an awful lot of vested interests and there's plenty of those influencers that really want to see this happen among children as well. And, whether it's in schools or other places, but anyway, I'll just throw that out there and you don't have to, neither of you have to respond or take blame for what I just said.
There is the part that I hear in that, again, I have a certain sympathy for a person, a biological male who transitioned in adulthood, but doesn't pass as female, very easily because they're 6 feet tall and have a hairy face and so on. their greatest wish is that they did transition earlier in order to have made their cosmetic outcome more to their advantage. To their point of view, it's easy to understand that they're trying to save kids from going through the difficulties that they did. That's not evil. I can understand that mindset. The problem is that these kids are not going through the same thing that my hypothetical adult is. But so they're not evil, they're mistaken.
I appreciate that clarification. I would still use the word evil, but not intentional evil, because there is evil and a harm done to these children.
The harm is genuine, but
yeah.
the intent is to try to save somebody from the pain I went through. So, again, although it's mistaken, I have a certain sympathy for that point of view or attempt to. They genuinely believe, or some of them can genuinely be in the belief that they're helping.
And Dr. Curlin, this is to your point, that this is self-harm. It comes, there's something here in this area. Look, we have pushed the time here, but I do want to just ask each of you, if you would, because the other set of questions we really need to get to is really parents. Somebody wrote in, it's like, our kids are going through this or have already gone through this, have already expressed a dysmorphia. Can you offer any direction, any resources, any encouragement? What would you say to parents whose adolescent, pre-adolescent children are struggling in this area?
I'd say, John, don't be surprised if it happens. Obviously, it's difficult. It is very common today for parents to note that their kids are struggling with questions about their sexuality, and now with questions about gender. And I think it's a difficult time. I would encourage parents to hang in there, to be patient, and to not be afraid to confidently tell their children, it's okay. I can imagine that's very confusing and difficult, but hang in there. You're going to be okay. You are whatever they are. You are a 10-year-old boy. I know you don't feel like a 10-year-old boy. You feel out of sorts. You feel more like a girl. You're a 10-year-old boy, and then do everything they can to not try to medicalize this experience. And that means even, I think the evidence is clear. They should discourage social transition. This is my opinion, because it tends to lead toward this whole medicalized gender transition. And keep your kids out of the hands of people that you don't trust, who are going to medicalize them potentially even without your wishes.
That's another question that came up, is how do you find the right counselor, which is something that is, I don't know if either of you know a clearinghouse we could point to, but if you do,
I don't. And I've had a number of counselors, personal friends, contacts, who've told me this is making their life very difficult. They live under fear that they're going to tell someone that they're going to be accused of doing conversion therapy just because they're trying to help a kid be patient and not create medical problems that, in addition to the struggle they're having with dysphoria. And a lot of them are actually stopping seeing children. They're so concerned about this, which of course only makes the challenge more difficult for parents.
Yeah. Dr. Cantor, do you have anything to add to parents?
The only part I would add is that gender, for over 99 out of 100 of these cases, the gender dysphoria is not the problem. It's a symptom. Something else is going on. Something's bothering the kid. They feel like they're not fitting in. The distress is genuine, but the distress is not genuine dysphoria, gender dysphoria. That's just the in thing they have for describing it. The important part is finding out what actually is bothering the kid and not fitting in and not feeling like they're like the other boys or like the other girls, and figuring that out.
And I think that's why it's so important to know that the suicide myth was a myth. because that hopefully gives parents the confidence. Because I've talked to parents that to say that the fear is, well, but what if they kill themselves? And I think to understand where the data is, and take every step that you can to keep your child safe. But it actually doesn't help to go along with the dysmorphia. It just doesn't. And hopefully that gives a lot of confidence. It was somewhere in the middle of 2023. I started to see too many Christians, too many parents, too many people that should know better. You could almost see kind of this second guessing. Well, maybe it's me. Maybe we've missed something. Maybe there's something here. And now we're in the middle of 2024, which is why we've done 2 of these conversations, Breakpoint Forum, saying, here's the medicine, here's the doctrine, here's the science, here's what we know. Have confidence, be the adult for the good of the child. That's what we're called to do. I want to just extend my thanks to both Dr. Curlin and Dr. Cantor for joining us this evening. Quickly, Dr. Curlin, where can people follow you or find you if they'd like to?
Particularly at the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative at Duke University. If you just search Theology and Medicine at Duke, you'll find more about that.
Yeah. And Dr. Cantor?
Easiest way probably is on Twitter, now X, at James Cantor, PhD.
There you go. All right. Well, listen, I also want to remind everyone about the Identity Project. That is designed for churches and for teachers and for parents. And if you type in that promo code BPFORUM, that gives you access there at a discount. So please check out identityproject.tv. To my guests, I say thank you. To our friends who are behind the scenes producing this at the Colson Center, great work. And thanks to all of you for joining us. We'll see you next time.